My name's Angelica Waddell, and I am with Polko National Research Center, and I lead communications here. And we are all about community engagement and using technology for that feedback process from your residents.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Sarah Atwood. I'm with the Center for New Democratic Processes. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We're based in Minnesota, but we work throughout the US, and we also do international work as well. My background is as a historian, so I come from a different kind of perspective into the work that I do now, but really we are a convening organization. So we try to bring people together to talk about tough problems that are facing their communities and to come to a series of recommendations that policymakers can act on. So we do interdisciplinary work, but really at the heart of it is deliberation and civic engagement. So really happy to be here. Shane, thanks for having us.
Oh, again, thank you guys. So I'm going to turn it over to you then with that. And I know you have an excellent presentation here and a lot of expertise to share. So without further ado, hand the ball to you.
Great, thanks, Shane. So as I said, I'm with the Center for New Democratic Processes. I'm the head of research and engagement with the organization, and I've been working with them for about 5 years now. We really are, as I said, an interdisciplinary organization, but really what we do in practice is we gather groups of the public who are broadly representative of a catchment area to come together and talk about I think this is referenced in the opening panel, a wicked problem, right? And so we get a demographically representative group of people together, what is often called a mini public. And so that way, those recommendations that they make together as a group can feed back into decision-making processes or even governing practices. So once we get participants together, they do a deep dive about the issue at hand, and they really do learning from a variety of perspectives. So we have everyone from city planners to business owners to community organizations come together and present. And then the participants themselves are tasked with deliberating and figuring out how to reconcile some of the information that they've heard, that they have engaged with witnesses about, and how to make a recommendation on behalf of their community. And so 3 things are really important to note about this work. Claudia mentioned this in her last presentation. It's a type of deliberation. Often these are called juries or assemblies, but they can also be called community panels. There's different jargon, but they really do the same thing. They task people with putting their heads together to solve a problem. And in this work, we always make sure that we can get compensation for those participants. And that's a way of lowering barriers to participation and helping to kind of level the playing field of who's volunteering to even contribute to this process and do this work. And we work really hard to make sure that the materials and the process itself is transparent for the broader public, as well as accessible for the participants, because a lot of times these will be very technically complex or divisive issues. And we want to make sure that the nuance of the problem presented isn't lost in the work itself. And that when a recommendation is reached, that recommendation is very rigorous, and it can go back to decision makers or folks like yourselves who are on this call today to say, look, the public has actually assessed what's realistic. It's not a pie in the sky recommendation, but they're working within these kind of legal, political, and financial parameters about what's actually possible. And then finally, I would say the other important thing to note is that it's an independent process. And I think this goes back to a lot of what has already been talked about today, especially in the opening panel, is that there's a lot of distrust between government and the public. And so having an independent process where we sort of act as a firewall between decision-making bodies and the public helps to ensure that there is a legitimacy when the work is being done in the room together or in the space with that mini public, as well as afterwards. So that way, charges of, well, this is a foregone conclusion, this isn't really a public engagement process, kind of all of that, those critiques, we work to make sure that it is independent at the end of the day, and that the resources put towards that type of engagement are purposeful. So that's a little about kind of a broad work. But I'll say, a lot of times when you think about deliberation or civic engagement, it's really flowery of like, come have pizza, sit for a couple of hours, get a gift card. And what I really want to emphasize now is that deliberation can be used and should be used in very complex problems. And that's actually where we find it works the best, because there's either a high level of distrust the public isn't even aware of the problem, or as I said earlier, they think maybe the issue at hand is a foregone conclusion. And so this engagement is just really a tick box exercise. So you can kind of see here some of the topics that we've done. We've used deliberation to kind of think through. So I'm going to go through quickly 3 case studies. These are super high level, but I wanted to just use these to incite how deliberation might be used in your community. You may have a problem that comes to top of mind of like, oh my gosh, we just need to make a decision on this. We've been thinking about this for years and we're completely stalled. There's total gridlock and I don't even want to deal with this problem anymore. Unfortunately, or fortunately, that's where deliberation can start to move the needle a bit. So when I say, these are really high level, we can come back and ask questions, but they're really different examples. But the thing that ties them together is the sort of golden thread is that they all revolve around really tough decisions. And it's not that there's a lack of information about what needs to be done or what the public thinks. It's actually that there's so much information that we don't know how to reconcile all of this data, right? So that can be public comment, that can be budgetary constrictions, that can be long-term planning. And so we use deliberation as a type of siphon where you can bring the public together, get some of that very technical information on the table, and you get that softer data, right? How people feel, what are the histories that they're bringing to this process? Why is there a sense of distrust or disillusionment? And so you start to understand where the public can reach moments of consensus. And from that, you start to understand, what can be done about a particular issue. So here I would say that the Flats Arterial Community Panel was a project that we were brought into with the City of Vancouver in Canada. And really, for 5 years, they had been gridlocked about what to do with an arterial road going through the city. And it's not that people were not involved. It's not that they didn't want to have their say. It's that people couldn't agree on what to do. And so here's where deliberation can help decision makers and the public to reconcile the very real restrictions that we're faced with in everyday decisions. And this is where I love being paired with Angelica, because I think with Vancouver, right, they had the big data sets. It was really, okay, we have that, but it doesn't really tell us where to go in terms of these 9 options on the table. So with Vancouver, we brought in community groups, the park department came in, city planners, advocacy groups. And really what happened is we composed a panel of participants who were demographically representative of the city. So you don't just get the same advocates, you don't get people who have a disproportionate interest in the project, don't have necessarily the privilege to volunteer their time. You get a mix, right? So you get that mini public again, and you get people interacting with one another who themselves say, I wouldn't necessarily be engaging with these other people if it wasn't for this panel. So I think there's already something a little special there, but the hard work is really getting them to analyze all of the stuff that city planners have to do, that finance professionals have to do. And at the end of it, and I think Martine said this, you get people saying, holy moly, this is really hard, but you give them a space and you create an incentive to say, this is for your community. And then they put their heads together and do some of that hard work. So I would also note here that there's an idea that the city had actually 8 approved. They had 8 approved plans for the street. And the community had been very vocal about a 9th option. And so what the city decided to do was allowed us to analyze that 9th option alongside those 8 feasible options. At the end of the process, there were 9 options for evaluation. The public voted, decided that they wanted that 9th community designed option. But in any good public engagement project, there's always a twist, okay? So the top option among participants, that 9th one, that community designed one, was actually, surprise, surprise, it was too expensive. So what the city decided to do was to create a 10th option. That 10th option took the participants' favorite, their number 1 choice, and it blended it with their second favorite choice, which was a feasible, in terms of budgetary kind of restrictions, option. So they created a 10th option, a community city solution. And what I want to say here is that, you know, what we found with the panel, an independent process was essential for legitimacy because there had been so much gridlock with this space. Number two, without the community panel, an unimaginable outcome was never possible. It was impossible. So the panel actually got them to that 10th place. And then number three, decision makers had to move forward because they invested in a finite process and put the resources in. There was an increased burden of proof for them to finally make a decision. So that's Vancouver. Here's a different one, rural energy and climate dialogues. These started with a different premise. We didn't have a particular question, but this was starting from the notion that rural communities are often left out of conversations about climate and extreme weather. So how can we encourage them and find a space where many publics can start to talk about the economic, the infrastructure, the cultural, the environmental impacts of climate change in their area. So that was a different series of conversations, but it was the same idea. Let's get together and talk about how we see climate change affecting our community. And then the last one that I'll share quickly is where a new hospital should be built in the UK. So this was three different villages or towns where the hospital might be built. And of course, the public, again, was at a crossroads because everyone knew the right answer to this question. The hospital should be built in my town. And so we got people together to talk about that. And again, we saw people shifting from it should be in my town to this is the location that's best for the whole of the region. And we actually had people who showed up to protest the process. At the end of it, go on the news and say, this is an awesome thing, but it should have happened a year ago. It should have happened earlier in our consultation process. And so, you know, I'm giving you kind of these three different examples to think about how increased scrutiny helps us make sense of this information tsunami, and it helps us cut through it in a way, because really deliberative processes are a resource. I know some might say they're not a resource, they're not a tool, but as a practitioner, I would say they actually are a tool. They're not meant to do everything. They're not built to do everything, nor should they. But really they help us to decipher what a discrete problem is. And then they help us craft a blueprint, not only for where the public wants to go, but it creates a path for the community to own that decision. And perhaps most importantly, get them to grapple with what they're willing to give up to get there. Because a lot of times public consultations skirt over that. And it's that trade-off element that a lot of times is the thing that can move the needle. We know we want this beautiful thing, but what do we have to give up to get there? That's the question that a lot of times gets decision makers on board of like, okay, this is realistic. It's working within these discrete parameters. And now we have a very clear direction to bring back to the broader community and say, look, these were your neighbors, these were your friends, your family members. They did this complex work. And here's something that's going to help us go forward. So that's what I would say. Angelica?
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. And I would like to just reiterate what Sarah has said, that really we need to come together. We need to solve these wicked problems, as we've heard earlier. And that's going to be a big part of how we're going to take information. Now, I'm going to talk about what can we do and what strategies can we take to take that public opinion data and how can we turn that into action. I'll talk a little bit about gathering that information, because really you do need to use all of your tools and your multiple touch points to really engage your community in something like a municipal budget or a strategic plan. But to make lasting decisions, you really need to gather that data in a strategic, proactive way that yields accurate results that you can trust. So it's, I think, a great way for you to think about what Sarah has said and think about what I'm about to tell you next, because these types of things go hand in hand together. If you're doing a really good job, you're going to do both of these types of things. Again, I'm with Polko National Research Center, Sarah next. And let me tell you a little bit about us. So we've been doing public opinion research for the last 30 years to help local governments be really successful in bringing that resident voice into the government decision-making process. And we do this through our award-winning survey and civic analytics platform on Polko. And there we also administer our scientific benchmark surveys where local governments can see how they perform with their data compared to others across the nation. So, for example, you may have heard of the National Community Survey and others like it. Next. All right, this is an exciting opportunity for y'all to engage with us. Shane has a little poll for everyone to take. What source of resident opinion do you find least helpful for community decision-making? There is a timer on the poll, so but this should be pretty interesting, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. Very interesting so far. Looks like it's a toss-up. Oh, now we've got either unverified or statistically invalid surveys. We also have social media is a second. All right. Looks like everyone's. Oh, we got a few more coming in. Very interesting. Sounds like we have a few people that are having least helpful public comments in person, and some that are, looks like we also have some not so helped out by phone calls and in emails. All right. All right, next. Now, I find it really interesting that y'all said, what you said, because I think it really mirrors what we're about to see and what we've seen in our research. Now, one of the reasons why we have the environment that we have today, this is a really interesting statistic that we have found in our research, is that fewer than 20% of US residents have ever attended a public meeting. And I mean ever in their entire life. So if we want to hear from these folks, that's going to force us to go to other spaces and create other opportunities for our residents to participate with government. Next. And as we see more and more in our time of current disruption, we're seeing increasing polarization that's impacting our communities. We see this is a big reason that so many of you are experiencing frustration with a lot of the common sources of public opinion chatter. And looking at public opinion about community on social media, for example, you'd think there's no hope for us to come together and solve our problems because we keep pointing the finger at the other person, and we seem so polarized, especially on something like social media. But the truth is that something like social media actually distorts the perception of what residents really think, because the vast majority of residents don't post political or community issues at all on their social media. So if we're only looking at Twitter, we're getting a distorted view of the truth. And what we find is that the vocal minority are the ones who express the more extreme viewpoints. So when we're gathering public opinion, we have to figure out how are we going to bring balance into that equation and hear from other folks. And that's also one of the biggest frustrations and reasons why surveys that are done in an unverified or a biased way create a distorted view as well. So how can we bring balance back in? Next. Now, the number one method to increase diversity in voices, increase that range of participation, is to reduce the burden to bring in that balance. So one of the first hurdles that we have to overcome is getting people to participate with us in the first place. And so we need to make it a little bit easier for people to engage with government if we're going to have them at all. And not only that, we have to think about what are the barriers. If it's, is it access? Is it the time of day? Is it the lack of technology? Is there a divide there? Is there a broadband divide? What are the things that are creating barriers? Are we expecting families to show up in the middle of the day or, people who are supposed to, they're working, and what are we doing to create barriers, and how can we reduce those barriers? And what we will find is that when more people have easier opportunities to engage with us, we actually will start seeing those results from our surveys being a lot more neutral and a lot more balanced, because you're not only hearing from the polarized few, you're going to start hearing more of them. And most people are really somewhere in the middle of that polarization spectrum. All right, next. And that's a great question on how did that 20% figure. So that is an aggregate. We've done research for about 25 years of data that has gone into that to come up with that figure now. And that is coming from our database, which includes like the National Community Survey that represents millions of American voices over the last 25 years. All right, so we also want to think about what are the ways that we can turn to start making those opportunities to engage our residents much easier for them. What are the things that y'all are doing in government to try and break down some of those participation barriers? So commonly we see public comment, resident comment, we see town hall meetings, and we see focus groups, and we see surveys and polls. Now, traditionally, when you're talking about in-person versus online, we talk about traditional being in person, and we talk about online being the new way things are being done. And at Polka, we tend to favor the methods that are a little further down the ladder, because if done correctly, those can bring a larger group of people to the table. So it's scalable using technology. And at Polka, we do use scientific methods to ensure that the results statistically represent the community as a whole. And we want to make sure that we can verify, we can have the opportunity to see, are these real people? Are these bots taking these surveys? Do they actually live here? Or are they from somewhere else and are trying to take our surveys, right? So these are things that we're always paying attention to, but we always want to really uphold that respondent privacy and confidentiality as well. So these are the things that we're looking at, and what we're trying to create an environment that's going to give the type of engagement and responses that are more scientific, so that they're more accurate. And if you're going to make a decision on them, for something like a budget, you're not just being responsive from Twitter, which we talked about being, distorted in a lot of ways, but doing something that's, okay, I'm going to make a decision and I want to engage people, but I want data that's going to be a little bit more accurate and useful that I can rely on. And so next. One of the things, if you are looking to capitalize on technology, is we'll say technology is great, and it also creates some hurdles that we need to overcome. One of those is technology. Everybody is using technology, right? We now have new hurdles and noise that we have to overcome. But if you're using technology, you can overcome that noise and make it easier for people to participate as well. So we can have more residents, more diverse people, more inclusive of that engagement process. And it's a lot cheaper in a lot of ways than some other things that we used to do traditionally before the modern day. But remember, you need to be using a lot of different touch points and methods. Next. And I'll move along quickly here, so we still have a few minutes for Q&A at the end. But you want to be using, once you have gathered that data, you really want to start using that throughout your policy life cycle and your budget cycles. So you want to identify your baselines. You want to see where you need to crowdsource information and where you need to dive in a little bit deeper and do something like a focus group, like what Sarah does, and say, hey, I found this out on my survey. I want to find out why. We oftentimes say that the survey tells you what residents think, but it doesn't necessarily tell you why they think it. So you may want to then leverage your focus group and really discuss that. And then you also want to engage your residents when it comes to priorities and coming up with solutions. And then you always need to, it's a complete loop, right? So then as you're collecting your data, you're using your data, you're incorporating it in that life cycle, you're also going to want to be making sure that you're evaluating throughout the process, tweaking your strategies, and continuing to move forward. So next. As you collect your data, I'm going to encourage everyone, don't sit on it. It's not an egg, and I promise you, if you sit on it, it's not going to hatch. So you're going to want to analyze that information and understand what that data is telling you, and then consider how it impacts everything in community livability. And so one of the things that we're doing here at Polko National Research Center is we have a new program called the Government Performance Action and Learning program. And it's in partnership with groups like ICMA, National League of Cities, a lot of academic partners like Arizona State University, among others. And this is really to bring in data together, create performance dashboards, create a partnership and a network for local governments to make data-driven decisions, which can be more holistic, and to say, all right, we've got all this big data about our community, but how can I distill that and filter that down to really be able to make a relevant and lasting decision here with my budget? So if you'd like to learn more about that, you can go to polko.us/GPAL to learn more about that. Next. And I just want to share a quick case study so you can see the power that engagement can have in something like a budget. So looking back at the last recession, a lot of economists are saying that we're on the heels of a recession right now, that we're on the edge of one. So let's take a look from our history to learn what we can do. And in Livermore, California, they did a survey to find that most residents had a very low ratings, low levels of satisfaction when we asked them, how do you feel about your own economic future in this community? And people didn't feel very positive about that. Next. And so what Livermore decided to do was to really get that data. They started to do a lot of other engagement plans and focus groups and all these things. And they said, okay, we need to make some changes. So let's bring in new job opportunities that the residents are telling us that they want. Let's create plans that the residents are involved with. Next. And as they brought in all of those new businesses and opportunities and jobs, they actually increased their next survey. All of their ratings in that area of economy really skyrocketed. It was very impressive. They won an award, a Voice of the People award for it. And they also ended up having from downtown Livermore was rated among the top downtown areas in the entire nation. So that was really impressive. And I'll go ahead to the discussion slide because we're a little over time.